Well, millions of South Africans are facing hard times since the outbreak of COVID-19. And government announced a 500 billion rand economic relief package. But the Budget Justice Coalition say the relief favours business and punishes the poor. To explain that further, we're joined by Daniel McLaren from Section 27. Daniel, thank you so much for your time and a very warm good morning to you. Now, it seems from this particular statement and report, so much concern has been raised on government's relief packages, saying that it favours more of business, of course, at the expense of the poor South Africans who are in need.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the first point to raise by the Budget Justice Coalition, which is organisations across the country working on the economy and public finances, but also health, education, food issues. So there's quite a kind of broad range of experiences of COVID-19 that's gone into our statement that we've released. The overall scale of the package, if you start to drill down into this 500 billion rand, it's not really as big as it sounds at 10% of GDP when you look at what's actually on offer. So the example about it maybe favours business slightly more than households, we wouldn't argue against any of the support for business being taken away. Actually, maybe some of that support needs to be more grant-based rather than loans, which small businesses will have to pay back in future. But if you look at the overall size, we think there's a good argument, given the likely length of the crisis is going to be longer than 6 months, and the likely impact on jobs, on hunger, on poverty is, I mean, the statistics that we're looking at are very, very dire. Yeah. We think that overall the package should be bolder and more ambitious, and will have to be if it's going to save those jobs and businesses and households from hunger. But if we just look at the cash transfers component, so how much of the package overall is actually going to go into people's pockets, individuals and households, rather than businesses, that amount comes to 88 billion rand, which is the UIF and the social grants component combined. And in the context of about half the population living on the edge of the poverty line and almost certainly being pushed into poverty, and that is a household income below 1,200 rand a month, we don't think that amount is adequate. And some of the grants which have been proposed, they are actually excluding children, they're excluding women in quite in ways which are unnecessary and should actually be expanded.
I'm going to come to how particularly you, of course, think this relief does not address issues of hunger in just a moment. But going back to my initial question with businesses, I understand that another concern that you raised was the 100 billion rand, which, of course, will be coming from the IMF, I understand, and also saying that, you know, it obviously comes with huge costs and has previously impacted negatively on some of the global south countries.
Yeah, look, I think the most important thing to say here, and certainly which our internal discussions between organisations are having, is that there has to be a public engagement on this as soon as possible, a public debate. We have to do this openly with lots of different voices involved. That's the first thing to say. At the moment, we've got approaches and conversations that are taking place between the Minister of Finance, the head of the Reserve Bank, Treasury officials and these institutions, which we're getting dribs and drabs of information, but there's no real effort to actually bring the public into the kind of details and technicalities here. That's the first thing. Secondly, on you know, whether we should be going to the IMF, whether we should take this money or whether we should just avoid them like the plague, there's internal differences, you know, even within the Budget Justice Coalition organization. Some people saying, look, the experience of so many countries is that you take a little bit under good terms initially, and you find yourself 5 years later with this kind of odious foreign-denominated dollar debt, conditions being imposed when you're struggling to make the payments, and it kind of drags you down. Others saying, look, if there's cheap money available, our debt to GDP, you know, requires us to take whatever cheap money is available. So I think the most important thing is that this conversation isn't one that's happening behind closed doors. The Treasury does bring the public into its confidence, and we have an open conversation on it.
Yeah, and obviously, of course, the messaging here is saying that, the relief shouldn't necessarily come at the expense of protecting, human rights, basic human rights, that is, in South Africa. Which brings me then to the issue of addressing, poverty and hunger within South Africa, because I believe that, during this lockdown, we've seen a lot of loopholes through the long queues we've seen in townships, in informal settlements and rural areas of people who've been in need of basic necessities such as food. But when we look at Stats SA's, information there with regards to the poverty line is standing at, people just, most South Africans surviving at just under 1,300 per person per month. Now, that brings the total to approximately 30 million South Africans. That's like 55% of the population. Do you think this relief package caters to the needs of those 30 million and more, I suppose, who are malnutritioned, without food, in desperate need of basic necessities?
Yeah, look, we appreciate that in the immediate period of a disaster, it's very difficult to design a program which is going to reach so many people. And it's absolutely right that about 50% of the population, in one way or another, because of unemployment, because of the informal sector totally shutting down, and the total lack of employment generating opportunities, the disruptions of food supplies, and just the fact that so many people were in or on the edge of poverty already, does mean that the scale of the need is very, very high. What's been proposed so far does have problems. It's not reaching everyone, and we're seeing that anecdotally in the reports which are coming out, but also in the evidence, the Human Sciences Research Council survey showing that up to 60% of households in informal settlements across the country are reporting that they've run out of money to buy food already. So what we're proposing is that, okay, look, much of what we've got in the package so far we've got, but now let's focus on actually improving it.
Right.
So a couple of ways that we can improve it. One, the child support grant top-up. There was seemingly an initial commitment to top that up per child, which makes sense because if you're looking after maybe orphans of someone who's passed away, maybe you have more than 2 or 3 children, you should be getting more money than a family which just has 1 or 2 children receiving that grant. It doesn't make sense to both get the same top-up. So the top-up must be for every single child, and that grant is targeted at children, rather than the Treasury proposal just to top it up per caregiver after May. And then the unemployment grant, there's this approach that's being taken on the COVID-19 unemployment grant to target people. There's eligibility criteria, and between 6 and 8 million people are targeted for that, and the amount is 350 Rand a month. And we think that a much better proposal that the Treasury needs to consider and the Cabinet needs to consider in the medium term, maybe in 6 months' time, ideally sooner, is a universal approach. Approach which picks up on the evidence that if you can offer a universal income package at a similar amount, or maybe even higher, you can recoup that through taxation on higher incomes, and administratively it's easier to administer, and also there's no exclusion factor. As soon as you target, you're guaranteed to exclude people who just miss out, who are on the edges, or for whatever reason don't have an address.
All right, Daniel, due to time, thank you so much. We'll have to leave it at that, but thank you so much for joining us this morning. That's Daniel McLaren from Section 27.